Now, the US company Harley-Davidson has become a victim of the trade war that's being waged by the Trump administration. It says it has to shift some of its manufacturing of its iconic motorcycles overseas in order to avoid getting hit by retaliatory European tariffs that came into effect last week Friday. However, President Trump has warned that if the company moves, it will be taxed, in his words, like never before. Zhao now explains.
The iconic American motorcycle maker Harley-Davidson, which was previously lauded by Donald Trump for building things in America, disappointed the U.S. president on Monday. Trump tweeted that he was surprised by the company's announcement that it will move some of its production out of the U.S. to avoid European Union tariffs. He criticized the motorcycle maker for waving the white flag after he fought hard for them. But Harley's leaving was a consequence of Trump's tariffs fight, which is supposed to protect American jobs by levying tariffs, including on imports of European steel and aluminum. The EU responded with retaliatory tariffs on more than $3 billion worth of U.S. goods, including motorcycles. For Harley, that means duties on its products will be raised from 6% to 31% if they continue to make their products in America. An additional cost of $2,200 will be added to each unit they export from the U.S. to the European market, where they sold 40,000 new motorcycles last year. That accounted for 16% of their total sales. Harley's internal analysis predicted EU tariffs will bring about a full-year impact of $90 million to $100 million US dollars, which is about 15% of the company's annual profits. Now, no matter how surprised Mr. Trump is, the largest market outside of the U.S. is just too big for Harley to give up. Zhao, CGTN.
All right, then. So let's get you the latest on this from CGTN's Liling Tan. She joins us now live from New York. So, Liling, aside from Harley-Davidson, are there any other firms who've publicly said, look, in order to avoid getting hit by the retaliatory tariffs from the EU, we have to move production out of the U.S.?
Not yet, Rama. In fact, we haven't seen other companies apart from Harley-Davidson officially announce any plans to shift production abroad. But that said, expectations are that if this continues to escalate, we'll likely hear more from American companies feeling the pressure on their bottom line and having little other options except to try and shift some of their production to overseas markets in order to avoid these retaliatory tariffs. That said, too, there are other businesses that are taking different kind of measures to try and mitigate the impact. For example, whiskey makers targeted by these retaliatory levies from the European Union. They are shifting some of their inventories to warehouses and operations abroad in order to avoid the EU tariffs, and also raising prices to try and pass on some of the costs to consumers. But it isn't just whiskey makers, of course. We have other U.S. products targeted by these tariffs. Tobacco from North Carolina, orange juice from Florida. So we expect to see more of a fallout over the coming days or weeks. Rama?
Indeed. Harley sells roughly 40% or so of its motorcycles overseas. It's very dependent on the U.S. market. But these extra tariffs on steel and aluminium will also hurt its bottom line. It's raised costs for them. So aren't the president's tariffs essentially doing a lot more harm than good to the very people he says he wants to help?
And that is the key question, isn't it? Now, for companies that rely on sourcing raw materials from the European Union, like steel and aluminium, but then also sell their finished products back to the EU, it's kind of a double whammy. They're hit on both ends. And common economic sense dictates that if your costs are going up and your profits going down, or your market of buyers is shrinking, then that's generally very bad business, no matter how you spin it. And the fear is that if this continues to escalate, the likelihood is that more and more American companies would be hurt rather than helped by Trump's trade policies. And the worst case scenario is now we have the U.S. tariffs on EU steel and aluminium. We have the EU retaliation on U.S. products, many of them agricultural. The concern now is that the Trump administration may retaliate by following through on threats to impose levies on European or German cars. Now, if that were to happen, the EU is expected to retaliate even further. So things could get a lot uglier than they already are.
Indeed. So shifting production overseas, though, not an option for the bourbon and the whiskey makers we spoke about a little earlier on. But how then would they respond when you've got tariff barriers going up, both in the Pacific and the Atlantic?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, why bourbon makers in particular don't really have the option. They don't have the option at all to shift production abroad because of a protective law that dates back to 1964 that restricts, or rather restricts basically the production of bourbon because it's supposed to be only an American-made product. It's kind of like how cognac is only cognac if it's made in the region of Cognac in France, otherwise it's just brandy. So they don't have the option of producing overseas, which is why bourbon makers are stockpiling products in warehouses and raising prices on their whiskeys or on their bourbon. For example, Brown-Forman, which is the American spirit and wine company and the owner of Jack Daniels, it is shifting some of its inventory to France, Poland, Spain, Germany in order to avoid the tariffs. And at the same time, it's also raising prices in this market. So it is particularly vulnerable, and not just because of the tariffs from the European Union, but it's also being targeted by tariffs from Mexico, Canada, as well as China.
Indeed. One last question for you, Li-Ling. So companies like Harley-Davidson, they're shutting down production plants in the U.S., like the one in Missouri. They're moving those jobs and that investment and that capital over to places like Thailand. Does this, though, erode support for Mr. Trump among his supporters, or are his voters essentially at a point where they just really don't care what happens either way?
Well, we are starting to see that erosion take place, especially among farmers in important Republican states that elected Trump into office. Now, the farming industry has already been trying to fend off some headwinds here, lower commodity prices, higher production rates, and then now on top of that, they face the prospect of these tariffs that really restrict their export markets. So it is becoming a problem for them. They are starting to feel the bite, and we had the executive director of the trade association Farmers for Free Trade, Brian Kuhl, was quoted by Reuters news agency saying that while in the past people in the farming community had given the president the benefit of the doubt, the impact is now starting to hit. And in addition to that, the U.S. Apple Association is set to start running TV ads in Michigan and Pennsylvania attacking Trump's tariffs. So if the president's supporters didn't really care about it before, more and more of them are starting to pay attention now.
Indeed. Let's see how all of this plays out when the midterms do turn around. We'll leave it there for the time being. That's Li-Ling Tan there live in New York.